there is no confirmed results in the literature. So basically, in our paper, we confirmed the existence of all these three channels, but we decided not to join the race to explore and identify more channels. Instead, we decided to give a bit more attention to small banks, because as I mentioned, the papers in the last slides, they only focus on large banks. But you guys probably will ask why we look at small banks. Because probably you guys know, although there are thousands of banks, small banks out there, but the market share is tiny compared to the entire banking sector. So why we look at small banks? Why bother? First reason, some people suggest that small banks can be quite important for financing small and medium enterprises, and SMEs are a quite important part of the economy as well. Secondly, others found that the lending behavior of small banks can be less pro-cyclical, and this is exactly what we want, right? We prefer to have a stable financial system rather than having things going up and down over time. Thirdly, and most importantly, there's a gap in the literature. So to the best of our knowledge, there is only one published paper in the literature that compares large and small banks in the context of Eurozone crisis, which is by Albert et al., published in JBF in 2014. And they found that small banks are less affected by sovereign risk changes. However, they did not consider the sovereign bond held by each individual bank. Instead, they used a country-level macro variable to approximate the sovereign risk. Secondly, their data sample stops at 2011, all right? And based on what we have, we showed that something really interesting happened right after that, and I'll show you what happened in just a few slides. So with those 2 points being said, this paper, truly a solid work, very good, but their conclusion may be limited due to their data availability and their data sample, and we aim to improve that. So this is data source. So the core variable sovereign bond exposure held by each bank, we have 2 sources. The first one, bank scope, which no longer exists, but luckily we managed to finish pretty much all the analysis before it's gone. So good for us. So bank scope used to report sovereign bond exposure for thousands of banks, large and small, covering quite a long period of time, pre-Eurozone crisis period, Eurozone crisis period. But the problem is it's less detailed. It's not very detailed, meaning for each bank at a time point, it only gives the aggregated sovereign security exposure. In contrast, the second data source, EBA, it gives very detailed data, especially regarding geographical breakdowns. So for example, for HSBC, it gives the Greek government that HSBC has, also the domestic British government exposure to Germany, to France, etc. But it only covers a few large banks and covering only the Eurozone crisis period. So in our paper, we only use, we mainly use bank scope to do the baseline analysis to compare large and small banks. And we use the detailed EBA data to confirm that the results and conclusions in the literature, we can also get similar results to make sure we can have consistent, robust results. Regarding the sample, in order to have a consistent sample, we only include 10 major Eurozone countries' banks, 5 core countries, 5 peripheral countries. And then we further split each region group into 3 subgroups based on their size. So we have large, medium, and small banks for core as well as peripheral. But we only focus on large and small because there is a clear cut. So this is the interesting thing I was talking about. So this graph shows the proportion of total government security exposure to total assets for a medium bank of a bank group. So if we look at the red dotted line, which is for small peripheral banks, we can see they have the highest sovereign exposure at all times. This is surprising because in the conventional idea, people tend to think, okay, small banks, they do more traditional banking business like mortgaging, lending to small business, taking deposit, rather than trading or holding government bonds. And the second interesting part is 2011. As I mentioned, Alberta's work stops at 2011, and if we still look at the red dotted line, right after that 2011, there is a very sharp increase. So by capturing this extra information, maybe we could identify something new. If we look at the solid red line, which is for a large peripheral bank, we can see their sovereign exposure increased quite considerably as well. But if we look at the blue, or actually black dotted line, it's for small core. So it's very, compared to the other groups, they barely hold sovereign securities. And it remains quite stable throughout the whole period. So based on this particular graph, we can see there are quite significant differences among each banking groups. So moving on, let's look at the other core variable, which is the growth rate of loans to the private sector. So if we look at large peripheral, we can see a clear cycle over there. Credit expansion before the Eurozone crisis and consecutive crunches during the Eurozone crisis period. For small peripheral, we also see some loan expansion before the Eurozone crisis, but we don't see as serious crunch as we saw in large peripheral. This is kind of unexpected. Why I'm saying we were expecting higher crunches here? Because of the substitution effect I mentioned in the beginning, as well as this graph, we see small peripheral, they increase a lot in sovereign holdings. So probably they should have a more serious credit crunch, but we don't see it here. So probably that means large peripheral, small peripheral, they behave quite differently, and we aim to figure it out later. So now let's look at the liability side. So on the left-hand side, we have growth rate of retail deposit. On the right-hand side, we have growth rate of both retail deposit and short-term wholesale. If we look at small core, it's quite stable, quite nice. If we look at small peripheral at 2011 here, for retail deposit, there was a drop. So if we look at here,